So I think it's my turn. So welcome, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to have you here. It's an honor to welcome you to exactly this topic, because this is what we do. Wir schaffen Zukunft. I mean, this is in German, that's our latest book. We talk about a topic which is super important from our point of view. I think it's the most important topic. We have just 30 minutes left, so we will hurry up for starting. To say a few words about me, I'm a visionary futurist. I'm a sustainability expert, tech innovator, psychologist, and mental health expert. I had the SIH Institute for Sustainability Management and Innovation, and I'm a CEO of different impact startups, and today I'm here, your presenter. So welcome, and I would like you to introduce yourself before we start into the discussion.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Last panel of the day, so hopefully we'll keep you awake before the party. I'm Hirander Misra. I'm chairman of a company called ZERO13. We're a climate fintech platform that started life on the carbon credit side, but now increasingly moving into biodiversity and other green real-world assets, based out of London, but lots of projects all over the world, including multiple countries in Africa, including Ghana and Kenya, and also in Southeast Asia as well.
Hi everyone, I'm Professor Lisa Wilson, and I am the Global Head of Strategic Partnerships for the Green Bond Corporation Group, and part of that is Carbon Capital Corporation. My professorship is actually in innovation, entrepreneurship and emergent technologies, but currently I'm originating projects in biodiversity, restorative practice and financial service products.
And my name is Christiane Gerstetter. I work at KlientEarth, which is a global environmental law charity, and I head our German office, and I'm a lawyer by training, as you may have guessed.
It's an honor to have you here, and I would like to start with a few numbers. So for decades, the fight against climate change has been waged with a single number in focus. Carbon CO2 concentrations now are at a record high, 424 parts per million as of May 2024, according to NOAA. We have rightly read about decarbonization, but in doing so, we risk losing sight of something even more fundamental: life itself. Let me take you to the Amazon rainforest. It's home to 10% of the world's known species. Yet in just the past 50 years, we've lost nearly 70% of its forest cover. And with it, countless unnamed species, gone before we could even study them, unfortunately. The World Wide Fund's 2022 Living Planet report tells us that globally, wildlife populations have declined by an average of 69% since 1970. So carbon may be measurable, but diversity is meaningful. It's complex, it's local, and it reflects the true health of our ecosystem. So it is something that we have to talk about. Thank you, and let us begin. And the second one is about facts and figures, setting the stage. And my first question goes to Lisa. Green bonds have traditionally focused on carbon emissions. So can you share some hard numbers on how biodiversity loss compares to climate change in terms of economic risk?
Yeah, I'm just going to deflect the question slightly and answer the question from a pragmatic point of view. So I think, first of all, biodiversity to me is a goal. It's not actually, it is a measure, but it is a goal that we need to attain. So biodiversity restorative practice is really where I work. But I think facts and figures don't represent the reality of biodiversity loss. I think that takes it to a commercial outcome that people can't understand. So I'm going to use two pragmatic examples. One where biodiversity loss has been caused by humans solely. It is being impacted by climate change and exacerbated. And the second example I use is my own hometown in Australia, where climate change is directly impacting biodiversity loss, and what that actually means in a very pragmatic way in terms of figures. The first I'm going to use is Ghana. Currently I lead a project in Ghana called Ghana Green Guard. It's a public-private partnership between the Environmental Protection Authority and the government of Ghana, and a number of private entities to provide biodiversity restorative practice and ecosystems. Very tangibly, illegal mining in Ghana has completely decimated Ghana. It's taken 90% of its afforestation, its water, its clean water. But that probably doesn't mean a lot to people like us. If you're in Ghana, it means I don't have clean drinking water. In Ghana, it means in 4 years they will be running out of water. They will be buying water in. It means that they can't get teachers to go to communities because there is no clean drinking water, which means there's no health facilities, which means there is no communication, there is no, health for women and all of those sorts of things. So they're not monetary measures per se, but they are very pragmatic ones that we can understand. And that's complete, I would say, biodiversity decimation. It's catastrophic to a country like Ghana. So going in to overcome that means it's not just one measure. Biodiversity is not just one measure. The Ghanaian program is one program, but underneath that we've got 60 to 70 different methodologies and programs that we can individually measure, and it might be something as simple as providing clean drinking water, which means we then have numbers of teachers returning and so forth. So that's one example where that's been a man-made biodiversity loss, and the facts and figures for that are it's a whole country's GDP that's been completely decimated by an activity that we've initiated. And partly that's because it is more profitable for people to work in illegal mining than it is to get jobs and employment from anywhere else, and that has to be factored into biodiversity. The other example I'm going to use, and it's very personal at the moment for me, because in a town where my son lives, 2 of my grandchildren live, the town that I lived in is experiencing the most catastrophic flooding they have ever known. They're now calling it a 1 in 500 year flood. Well, that doesn't exist because Australia hasn't even existed for that long. And that is 100% by climate change. And you might think, well, how does that relate to biodiversity? Well, after these catastrophic floods, it completely decimates an area. So you've got people that don't go back to farming. There's youth that won't stay. There'll be people that can't get mortgages because they can't insure their homes. There's people there that, we won't get educators and so forth. So I think measuring biodiversity is not just one factor. You cannot equate it to one factor.
Thank you for this important point, Hirander. Financial markets are waking up to nature-related risk, thank God. What other points or trends convinced you that biodiversity is the next critical metric for investors?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, I spent 28 years in financial markets and really only got into sustainability about two and a half years ago. But it was interesting because, what made me realize there was a problem was, increasingly we were obsessed on the financial market side with quarterly reports, half-yearly reports and annual reports. And we really didn't understand the impact of what we were doing as companies. It was all geared towards profit and not really intangible metrics like biodiversity. And, having been in that market for a long time, I realized it was very short-termist, and it can only lead to kind of negative effects. Coupled with that, we were quite fortunate where we got involved in a smallholder agricultural project in Malawi, where there wasn't enough smallholder finance, to buy inputs, pesticides, fertilizer, seeds. And even with a security to back any loans, the banks were charging 25 to 30% interest rates. And yet, that was impacting kind of incomes directly because it became too expensive to farm, leading on from Lisa's points. But we realized we did a study and there was a direct impact on children's nutrition and health. So, really, it's much more than an ethical question, actually. It's also a question of where we fundamentally go, aligned with, 4 or 5 year political election cycles and company CEOs being judged by results and no longer being in a role if they don't deliver those results. So I think it's got to require a change in mindset. But we're beginning to see that happen. Just to talk about some statistics here, the United Nations Environment Programme looks at some statistics around nature-based solutions, so investment products. And really, if you look at 2020, there was about $9.4 billion worth of assets held in nature-based solutions. If you go and fast forward to 2024, that's 102 billion. And similarly, if you look at holdings that could be ESG compliant, and that's not just biodiversity assets, but a broader range of sustainable assets. I mean, Bloomberg estimate those currently at being $30 trillion worth of assets held across the market. And by 2030, they estimate that going up to 40 trillion. So actually, it's already happening. Those that don't go into it fundamentally as firms have to question their very existence as we move forward.
Numbers we have to notice. Thank you very much for sharing this with us. Christiane, KlientEarth is very well known for being an environmental law institution and fighting also for biodiversity. Can you cite a legal case where biodiversity loss had greater financial repercussions than carbon emissions?
I'll come to that question in a second, but perhaps let me start by something else and tell you how we think actually about the biodiversity crisis. Mm-hmm. Because I think when we look at the state of the environment, we have different crises. I mean, we have a climate crisis, we have a biodiversity crisis, we have a pollution crisis, and we have planetary boundaries, and many of them we are actually exceeding. Mm-hmm. And I do not think that we can think about biodiversity in isolation of these other crises. For example, there's very strong interlinkages between the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. I mean, you mentioned the Amazon, for example. If the Amazon is deforested, which it currently is being done, I mean, it's being cut down, then that will remove a very important global carbon sink from the planet. And on the other hand, the climate crisis has an impact on forests, which are oftentimes not healthy, for example, in Germany, and if they're not healthy, they have much less storage capacity for carbon. So, these things are interlinked, and I don't think we can think about them in isolation. Obviously, biodiversity has a value to all of us as humans, also to businesses. I mean, the European Central Bank has actually estimated that more than 70% of all businesses in the Eurozone use one or more ecosystem services. And if you do not know that term, that's basically what nature provides to all of us for free. Clean water, clean air, if we let it, if we, keep it in a good state. And I think a lot of businesses, especially ones that, for example, work in agriculture, work in food, work in seafood, they have very material financial risk from the loss of biodiversity. If, the soils get depleted, if they are poisonous because of all the pesticides that are dumped on them, then they will yield less, and that will affect your business. There's also cases where companies have been held liable for biodiversity damage. Perhaps extreme case that is also a bit unusual is the deep water oil spill. Maybe the older ones of you still remember that big oil platform in the ocean, with an accident, really big oil spills, and the company, which was BP, really paid billions in US dollar in compensation in cleanup costs. So this can happen. I mean, it's unusual, it was an accident, but there are real liability risks for companies. But I would also say perhaps this shouldn't actually matter. I mean, we are humans, we live on a planet, we don't have a second planet. Mm-hmm. You may be business representatives, but you're also citizens, you are perhaps parents, you perhaps care about the future. And even if biodiversity wasn't worth a single cent, we should care about it because we need a healthy planet to live on.
Very good point. Thank you also very much, Christiane, that you mentioned the planet boundaries, where all is together and we see that there are relevances and where we don't know when there is this point of no return. And we know that we want to live in this ecosystem for further. We know how to live in this ecosystem. We don't know what happened if it turns around, and we have this called also Kipppunkt, right? So thank you very much for mentioning this and putting it in a completely holistic view, because this is important. We can't do it, of course, now. We have just 40 minutes left. But Lisa, you know a lot from science, but you are also very much a really important project. If we go into this, a lot of people from external views say biodiversity is just a kind of greenwashing 2.0. How do you respond to those who doubt its sincerity?
I would disagree with them immensely, and I'm going to pick up a point that Christiane made. I think we've also got a financial crisis on top of those global crises. So biodiversity, as I mentioned before, is a goal. It is a measure, but it's also a goal. So again, if I use a couple of examples, so Ghana, obviously, I said it's a program, and there's 60 to 70 projects that sit underneath that, and it can be anything from agroforestry to blue carbon to clean drinking water to EV vehicles to flood mitigation activities and a whole range of things, and even capacity building for the global south and the least developed countries, because they actually need to have the capacity to be, and we need to devolve autonomy back to those countries to be able to resolve some of their own challenges. But part of the problem that goes with that is the fact that we still don't have the capital flowing to, I would say, biodiversity transition and restoration. And part of that is carbon markets. We have constantly conversations with the institutional capital side, and I had some today with some of the big pension managers, and they're saying we can't invest because it's not in our regulated mandate to do so. You all might sit there and think that they're greenwashing, but I can tell you that the regulations do not permit them to do so. So I think there is a financial crisis in the sense that we need to present them with some new financial tools, but we also need to make sure that those financial tools allow projects and programs that are building biodiversity restoration and using things like climate finance through carbon, so forth, to change the socio-economic environment in those programs. So I think when people say to me, is it greenwashing? The answer is no. I think greenwashing is an overused emotive term that deflects from the really good work that's being done there. I mean, I've got 3 big projects, 3 of the biggest in the world, and I can assure you that we have trust and confidence in everything that we do. We have technology from what we would call source to sale. There isn't a problem in integrity around the way carbon credits are produced, for example. There isn't an integrity issue in our recognition that measuring biodiversity is a multiple task. But I think we are choosing to ignore some of those things, and we are choosing to not engage with the capital and the institutional markets, and suggesting that if we drive money and we make this a commercial flow and that we make this an economic reason, that in itself becomes greenwashing, and it doesn't. Everything works on having sufficient capital flow. We need trillions of dollars to flow into the financial and all the crises that Christiane mentioned, and unless we can actually change our thinking on commercialising some of those, we will never shift that capital to where it needs to go. And that largely sits with the global south and least developed countries who, to Hirander's point, are still paying over 30 to 40% debt rates. And that means we're driving those countries further and further into biodiversity loss. We have to have new financial tools that get those down to sub-10, like we can in Europe or anywhere else, to restore the Amazons, the Nepals, the Ghanas, and many others.
Good point. And I like also your point together, as Christiane mentions, the holistic view, and we need to have this multiple view biodiversity. Of course, many people like to have a standardization, right? They ask for standardization, for KPIs, for measurement, for overlapping, for comparison of countries. Hirander, diversity is complex and local. It is even possible to create a universal biodiversity matrix, or should we stop trying and accept that it's about diversity and we have to or need other matrices to measure that?
Yeah, I mean, as Lisa said, I mean, there's multiple metrics here, but also as Christiane said, we look at biodiversity and we know there's multiple studies out there. There's a direct correlation with water, energy, and food security. So, I mean, these are fundamentally factors. We speak about, resource plundering in the global south, and touching upon Lisa's point, and we can't kill the goose that lays a golden egg, but ultimately, us in the West need that security most of all, as we've seen with energy crisis, as the Middle East saw, during COVID, with food crisis, etc. So it's the developing countries that actually need this most. Sometimes we have a head in the sand saying, it's not our problem. That's the first point. The other thing is, yes, it's a complex set of factors, but ultimately, I agree with Lisa. We can also make this economic. There is a social angle here. Training, education, and awareness is important, not just in the global north, but also in the global south. And also aligning policy and regulation with that is also important. So we do a lot of work. I mean, just to give you a couple of practical examples, we do a lot of work in Kenya. And there's one project called the Kaptagat Forest Project, and it encompasses 111,000 hectares of area and 28,000 families. Now, there's a large program there, but one of the things to look at was, okay, you could just plant trees or preserve trees, but actually, how does the local population get an income where they were chopping wood and they were selling that or using that for fuel? That costs money. So now they're moving into agroforestry, whether it's macadamia, avocados. That's leading to tree plantation, but it's also leading to an income stream. At the same time, I was there the day that USAID got disbanded, and everyone thinks, okay, it won't have an impact, or it's a micro level. That directly impacts things like healthcare directly. And so in many ways, that's bad, but actually it's going to lead to some good in all of this, because these governments are then saying, well, actually, how do we make this economic? And at the same time, how do we support grant funding combined with economic value, because some of that can be matched off and bring more capital in. Other areas where we're actually seeing really interesting routes of capital, there's a lot of value that's been created on the Web3 side. Now, on the Web3 side, those asset holders are looking to diversify away from just crypto into real-world assets, and green assets are high on the agenda. So Tether recently, is one of the leading stablecoins, has invested in a Latin American agricultural company just to do that as well. And another example, Lisa mentioned blue carbon. We're in the Seychelles, we have some regulated businesses there. There's an area called the Aldabra Islands. I mean, that's over 410,000 square kilometers, larger than Germany by size. There's a lot going on where a lot of the work they've done around biodiversity and biodiversity credits, which are now emerging, has led to 85% preservation. In terms of what they're doing with that habitat, with a focus on seagrass and mangroves as well.
Thank you so much. I mean, this is great to hear that something is ongoing already. This is, of course, drops. We need to have much more. Christiane, if somebody would ask you, what are the policies which should take place in the matter of diversity? What would you answer?
I mean, I'm glad that you asked for policies, because I think indeed the situation is complex and we will need more than one policy. I mean, if we are talking about sort of policy that are adopted by governments and not companies, I would say that actually the EU already has quite a number of good laws in place. It has also recently adopted more good policies, like the nature restoration law, or also the CSDDD, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. But I also have to say that these are under attacks. I mean, there are sort of attempts and calls for weakening them. So I think an important thing to do is now to get together and basically save these laws and make sure they are still ambitious and they have teeth. And I think as companies, you have an important role to play in that and help with that. Another thing that I would say is that laws actually that exist and that are good need to be enforced. And I think that is oftentimes lacking in the environmental field, and that is also then something where we as an environmental law charity intervene. I can give you one example. There's a very old and also biodiverse forest in Poland. It is called Białowieża. I struggle with that always, but I think I got it right. It has a really high biodiversity value, and a couple of years ago, the Polish government actually permitted logging in that forest. And citizens started to be concerned with that, and then KlientEarth, our colleagues in the Warsaw office, took up that case. They wrote a complaint to the EU Commission because we were of the view that this logging was not in conformity with EU nature laws. The EU Commission followed our approach. They took the Polish government to the European Court of Justice. The European Court of Justice says this is actually not in line with nature law, and in the end, the logging stopped. And not only that, the case, I think, also really changed the discourse about logging in Poland. There was a huge citizen movement, and right now the Polish government is actually aiming to protect a certain share of its forest from logging. And people have approached us from Romania, where they have similar issues. So, this is also having some kind of radiance beyond just one country. So I think this is what the law can do if it is properly enforced, and we're trying to help with that.
Thank you very much indeed. You have a very deep insight into what companies do, but also investors is something you're in deep contact with. What would you give an investor who's still hesitating an idea for how to integrate biodiversity into his portfolio?
Again, I would say, I'm going to change the question slightly. I think there needs to be a very pragmatic mind shift away from biodiversity restoration and climate change and anything that's associated with those crises as we've talked about. There needs to be a mind shift to take it away from it being considered a cost, so move it from the profit and loss sheet to the balance sheet. And that's a mind shift, because at the moment everybody says, what is it going to cost me? And so I turn around and say, well, if I do this, you could shift it to the balance sheet. So that's a definitive mind shift that you might have. And I'll use a very pragmatic example. I was in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia speaking on the integrity of Islamic finance, actually, into climate finance. And one of the ladies was on my panel said that in this case it was Nigeria, she would love to see that a carbon credit became the next commodity export out of Nigeria. Now bear in mind, Nigeria sits at 144th out of 148 on the corruption scale in the world, so their integrity doesn't sit very high. So going through the commodity markets is not an easy pathway for them to export anything. And I said to her, well, you could think about it another way. What if we could put your carbon asset into a structured financial product that was listed in Switzerland? We've just exported your commodity without it actually leaving the country. She said, I never thought about that. So I think my answer to the question would be that we need to think about climate and biodiversity restoration in a very different way by creating different financial tools. And the second thing is, I don't think that we consider capacity building importantly enough. So at the moment I'm doing a lot of work with the African Development Bank, and they have a myriad of programs that sit in underneath their portfolio. And every single one of them, the first point is not about driving finance, it's about ensuring that there is capacity building for every cent that goes into any African project. And there's 54 nations in Africa. So they want exporting our knowledge to those countries so that we do devolve autonomy and build capacity in climate finance, in biodiversity restoration. We have to have a greater value commercially on biodiversity, ecosystems and climate than we do on its loss, and we don't at the moment. We're still sitting there saying, well, how do we repair it? We've got to have a value that's better for them, because if it's more profitable for a 7-year-old child to engage in illegal mining than it is to go out and engage in going to school and picking up plastic and turning that into a recycled economy, then we've got a problem. So I would answer it that way.
Thank you very much. I mean, we could talk that much further. The last word and the last question goes to Hirander. So we talked at the beginning about carbon tracking, and not these are Christiane, Hirander, you talked about it. What innovation do we need to make biodiversity data just as accessible?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Lisa mentioned, there's two things, a macro level and a local level. Structured products are a great way of that being accessible. I mean, not just Switzerland, Deutsche Börse here as well has a good regime for that. And we're tapping into both public and private capital. But there's no substitute on the ground. It was interesting, we're doing some work with the EPA in Ghana, on the other side of what Lisa's doing. And it was interesting, at the Ghana Pavilion at COP29 in Baku, and Ghana's a big producer of cocoa, whereas actually the Swiss make a lot of money on that product. They might have the milk, but they import the cocoa. And the Ghanaians were actually showcasing the chocolate they were now making. So I think a lot of that is, the assets are there. In Nigeria, over 80% of tomatoes get destroyed in transport on the roads because the roads are so bad, right? Whereas actually the value is in making the tomato puree or tinning the tomatoes. So I think a lot of that boils down to education, awareness, and economic opportunity. It is available on the ground. There are some very entrepreneurial enterprises now emerging. It was interesting. I learned today Qingdao in China was a German colony way back in the day, but Tsingtao beer comes from the fact that the Germans taught them how to make beer, and now it's exported all over the world and it's economic. So I think we can give them the skill sets, as Lisa said, and at the same time, teach them how to fish rather than fish for them. So aid going away isn't a bad thing.
Thank you so much. So we have some hope. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, and I think they should receive a big applause. Thank you.
Thank you.